Hi, I'm Lou Eisen, boxing writer, author, historian, and this is Ring Talk. And today we're going to discuss part two of the mob in boxing, the mob's influence in boxing, and we're calling this episode "They Murdered Boxing." That's the name of a series of 6 articles written by the magnificent Dan Parker, who was the most consistently brilliant sports writer, I think, of the 20th century, and he stood up to them. He stood up to the mob from the 30s and 40s on. He wrote for the New York Daily News. Parker was 6'4", 275, stormed the beaches at Normandy, at Omaha Beach. So when two mobsters came to his house to intimidate him, he answered the door with an M1 carbine and, beat the hell out of them. So this was a guy that was not going to be intimidated. And he laid out all of it from beginning to end, how the mob brutalized managers, boxers, family of managers and boxers, trainers, promoters. And this in time led to indictments and convictions and jail time for Frankie Carbo, who ran boxing then for the Lucchese crime family in New York, and his cohort Blinky Palermo. Both were vicious, vile, evil works of garbage, and putting them in prison was too good for them. But that's what the law allowed. Frankie Carbo was first came to New York, the United States, from Agrigento, Italy, in the early 1900s. And I guess he was about 10 when he got here. And his father, Angelo Carbo, and his mother, Clementina, loved him. They were hardworking, and they came to the United States looking for riches, but all they found was, more misery. They came here for economic opportunity, but his father ended up working long hours for short money. He was a day laborer. He was illiterate, so his job prospects were minimal, and he died at the age of 54 in 1931 from tuberculosis. And by that time, Frankie Carbo was already a member of Murder Incorporated. In fact, he was so good at it, he was put on retainer. He did specialized hits. In other words, if you were going to hit a politician, someone who was important, or a very well-known mob boss, Carbo was the guy you wanted because he could do it well, do it quickly, and get in, get out, and not get seen. And that's why he was one of the very few killers kept on retainer. He took over from Oni Madden. Now, when people look at Carbo's sphere of influence, they'll say, well, late 40s, early, through the 50s. But if you research it, he actually started much earlier because of Oni Madden's continually being hassled by state, federal police, and the FBI. He left New York in 1935 and moved to Hot Springs, Arkansas. He still got money monthly from the mob for his various rackets, especially boxing, and he'd set up the blueprint on how to exploit boxing. And essentially what Madden did was, he said, you take a large percentage from the manager, you take a large percentage from both fighters, you take a lot of money from the gross gate receipts, and you fix the fights, and then you bet on the fights after you fix them. And obviously you don't bet, because betting implies risk. So the mob would never put their money in a risky venture. So what the mob did was they would bet on who they knew would win the fight, and then they'd rip off the bookies. So the fans got ripped off, the fighters got ripped off, the promoters got ripped off, the managers, the trainers, and later, radio people got ripped off who invested money into these fights, and also television sponsors got ripped off later on. So, and what Madden would do was he would say to his cohorts, some of the fights should be on the level. Right, we have to have some fights that are on the level. We don't want to lose every fan in the sport, so some fights would be on the level. And another reason some fights are on the level is because there's a lot of competition between mobsters to see who was smart enough to have chosen the better fighter. So they would let them fight on the level and see who won. But a lot of times they were fixed. And this mob control of boxing and certain fighters didn't end when a fighter's career retired. Ash Resnick, who was a mobster from New York from the 40s, who was the main handler of Sonny Liston, he used Joe Louis in the 60s and 70s, but mostly the 60s, to collect mob debts in Vegas. He'd take Joe Louis along. So, I mean, it's so sad to hear, but you know, they controlled Lewis. They took money from Lewis. You know, they shot Lewis full of heroin, got him addicted to that. So they did. I mean, this to me is like tampering with God. I mean, Lewis was the greatest fighting machine that ever lived, and to treat him that way was just despicable, beyond despicable. So Oni Madden emigrated with his parents to the United States. And in school, of course, he was your typical bully. He wasn't physically big, but that didn't mean that much. He picked on all the other kids. He associated with bullies that were 4 or 5 years older than him. And, you know, it was just a living hell for other kids who didn't have the gumption or the wherewithal to fight back. You know, lunch was hell, recess was hell. Going to and coming from school, he'd take their food, their money, everything. If he wanted a coat, he'd take it. And his parents were frantic because there's nothing they could do to stop him. And you know, they went to the courts when he got caught, and they said there's nothing we can do, and they put him in juvenile detention, and all that did was teach him how to be a better criminal. So when he got out, he graduated from schoolyards, and he went to uh, street street push peddlers. You know, guys in the street who'd be pushing carts full of groceries and different foods, and he'd shake them down. You know, he'd just steal their stuff, or he'd say, if you don't want someone hurting you, pay me this much. And these guys were making nothing anyways. And then he graduated on to different other protection rackets. And one of them was cab drivers. So he'd go to different cab drivers and say, if you don't want to be robbed or hurt, then pay me and I'll offer you protection. And this was New York. And one of the cab drivers, you know, told him to take his protection racket and shove it up his ass. And the thing about Oni Manna was he was a psychopath, a genuine psychopath, and he was entirely devoid of empathy or morals. So this was not how you talk to him. He did not take kindly to such rude comments, or he didn't take kindly to anyone disagreeing with him. And this guy brought along cab driver, a man named Albert Weber, who was essentially muscle and huge guy. And the guy put his hands on Carbo and shoved him. And Carbo just calmly took out a gun and put it to the guy's head and blew his head off. And this is a pattern in the mob for well over 140 years. You know, people look at Jimmy Hoffa and they say, well, Hoffa was killed because he threatened the mob with going to the newspaper to tell them about how the mob had helped him, which was already well known anyways. But really, Jimmy Hoffa was killed because in prison he got into a fight with Tony Provenzano. When Provenzano said, we're going to get you out, he was a mobster and a big time mobster, but you just won't run the Teamsters. And Hoffa was so angry, physically accosted Provenzano. You don't put your hands on a made guy. That's a sure ticket, quick ticket to the boneyard. And that's what happened. He put his hands on Provenzano. On that point, he was a dead man. Now, getting back to Carbo, Carbo said this guy grabbed me and shoved me first, and he did. And Carbo was sentenced to 4 years for manslaughter and was out in 18 months, thanks to his lawyers and the fact that they greased different officials. This is what the mob could do. The mob could say to different judges and parole board members and officials, we'd like to get him out sooner. Well, we can't. He did this. Well, what if I give you $100,000 in cash and you never have to declare it? No one will ever know where it came from. So it's hard for different officials to turn that down. These are guys making 3, 4, 5 grand a year, 8 grand a year, and to be offered 100 grand in cash that you'll never have to declare or declare to the IRS or to anyone. It's hard to turn that down. And all they want you to do is let someone out like Carbo, who's eventually going to get out anyways. You can't stop them all. I mean, it's wrong what they did, but they did it. And Carbo gets out, and he moved into the vacuum that Oni Madden had created. much sooner than people realized in the late 1930s. And at this point, it's the reign of Joe Louis, and of course, Jimmy the Boy Bandit Johnson was gone. Mike Jacobs, Uncle Mike, was firmly ensconced in the Madison Square Garden as the promoter of the 20th Century Sporting Club, along with his brother-in-law Saul Strauss. And Madden exercised influence over certain fighters and helped them get title shots. And he was doing this in every weight division. Also, the fact that Julian Black and John Roxburgh were Joe Louis's managers and were also criminals, part of the African American underworld, which would have been necessary. Otherwise, Louis never would have got a chance at the big time. And, they were doing business with Mike Jacobs. And Louis was also exploited by the mob, especially when Jacobs got ill and had a heart attack or stroke, excuse me, in the middle to late 40s. And then Carville saw his chance to move in and take over completely, which is what he did. And he got rid of the 20th Century Sporting Club and formed the International Boxing Club with James D. Norris, who was the owner of the Chicago Blackhawks, owned part of the Detroit Red Wings, owned the Olympia Stadium in Detroit, owned the stadium in which the hockey arena in which the Blackhawks played, owned a piece of a lot of hockey teams. But he loved hanging out with gangsters. That was his thing. And so you could always see him with Carbo. And he also owned racehorses and Palermo and other people. And from 35 to 45, the mob, had tremendous control. And it went way beyond that too, over boxing. So you have Dempsey, then you have Gene Tunney. Tunney retires, and then you have a tournament to see who wins. And Jack Sharkey is beating Max Schmeling, hits him low, and Schmeling's considered a winner. For the first time, a guy wins the title after he's been fouled and knocked out. And then they have the rematch, which Schmeling actually won, but they gave it to Sharkey, and Sharkey holds the title, and he loses it to Primo Carnera. Primo Carnera was the case in point for professional boxing as the most hard luck case ever. Now, here's an interesting thing. Carnera was the focus of the movie The Harder They Fall, written by Bud Schulberg. And done in 1957, it was Humphrey Bogart's last movie. And I met Bud Schulberg and spoke to him for quite a long time. Angelo Dundee introduced us on the set of Cinderella Man. He'd come up to see Angelo. And he told me some wonderful stories. First of all, this is a mind-blowing story. Bud Schulberg, who was in his 90s when I spoke to him, I think 93, 94, in 2004, he was sitting in fourth row, 1919, July 4th, in Toledo, Ohio, when Jack Dempsey knocked out Jess Willard for the world heavyweight title. He was sitting with his father, B.P. Schulberg, who was the president of Paramount Films. And I asked him about a lot of things. About Dempsey, they said his gloves were loaded. He said, no, Dempsey's gloves weren't loaded. There's photos you can get, and he showed me where to get them, which I did. There's photos you can get of Dempsey entered the ring with his hands wrapped. He also said Walter Moynihan, who was the trainer for Jess Willard, was in the dressing room, which you would do, which you still do, of Jack Dempsey when he got his hands wrapped, and he signed off on them. He said, no, they're kosher. There's nothing added to them, no plaster of Paris. Doc Kearns claimed that years later, and he claimed it years later because he was a rogue and he'd spent a lot of his money and Dempsey's money, and whenever he needed money, he would peddle these fictions to different magazines like Sports Illustrated in order to get some money. But Kearns inherently understood how the mob controlled boxing, and he also understood how to get along with them and get his fighters, weave them through that intricate mob minefield to world titles, which he did with, Mickey Walker and Jack Dempsey and Archie Moore. Archie Moore is a hard luck case because Archie Moore was the best light heavyweight in the world, and at that time still waited 12 years to get a world title shot at Joey Maxim, and he won. Still had to beat Maxim several more times before they actually let him go. And beating Maxim was one thing, but getting Maxim's manager, Jack Kearns, was great because Moore had steadfastly refused to do business with the mob. He knew what happened when you did business with the mob. He knew from looking at Henry Armstrong. Look what the mob did to him. Armstrong had hundreds of fights, was simultaneously a three division world champion, and ended up broke. And this is what the mob did with all fighters. That's the one thing all fighters dealing with the mob had in common. They ended up broke, uh, um, pugilistic, dementia, and indigent. In other words, homeless. Now, guys that did business with the mob, fighters, managers, didn't do it voluntarily. They had no choice. These guys come to you, they tell you what's going to happen. There's 20 guys standing behind you, and there's hundreds more. So you're going to do what they say or they'll kill you. As I said last week, the mob never made any idle threats. If the mob said they were going to kill you, they'd kill you. And most of the times they wouldn't say. And one of the mob's favorite tricks, and I said this last week with regards to the 1919 World Series of the Chicago Black Sox, was the fact that they would, if you were the fighter, they wanted to go down, and they did this to the Black Sox players. But if they said to you, I know you're the champ, but you're going to go down in the fifth round to our fighter, and the champ would say, well, that guy's a bum. That guy's got 15 wins and 13 losses. And they would say, okay, champ. Here's a photograph of your wife. Here's a photograph of your daughter at school. Here's a photograph of your son with his friends. And they would just do that. In other words, we know where your family is. We know where your parents are, your sister's kids. In other words, we can kill you anytime and your family anytime we want. And there's virtually nothing you can do about it. What are you going to do? You're going to go to the police? The police are bought off by them. You're going to go to government officials? They're bought off by the mob. There's virtually nothing you can do. You can either play ball with them and do what they want, or you can get another profession, which was probably the best thing you could do. But these guys didn't have other skills. This was during the Depression, right after, and during World War II. And a lot of times it was difficult to get into other professions. It was almost impossible. So, and this was a chosen profession of a lot of people. So it was very difficult for these people to find another way to make money. And with the mob, it wasn't just saying you have to go down. If you go down, we'll give you 80 grand for the fight. That wasn't the point of losing on purpose. The point was they never lived up to the money they were going to pay you. You were promised 80 grand. You'd be lucky to get 2 or 3 grand. If you complained, you get a pistol whipping. If you complained again, you die. So the mob just treated everyone like garbage. They looked at it as their personal fiefdom. Why did the mob get away with it for so long? Because boxing has no centralized governing body. Each state had a commission, and that made it easier for different mob families in each state to control fighters. So it was a national syndicate, but the mob in New York could call people they knew from the mob in Los Angeles and have them talk to certain fighters to get them to do certain things, and managers. And Carbo essentially controlled it all. So he would go to LA, which ended up being his downfall eventually, or Kansas City or Boston or another place. And he would make sure that his rules and his orders were followed. One of the stories about Carbo, this happened in the 50s. Last week I speak a lot to Jimmy Dundee. Jimmy is Angelo Dundee's son. So he's 7 years older than me. I'm 62. So he was close with Muhammad, and he knew all these different people that his father didn't deal with, but his uncle Chris had to deal with, but somehow circumvented them and still succeeded. That was the main thing about Ali and Angelo Dundee and Chris Dundee. They were able to go against the mob without the mob knowing it, and doing it in such a subtle way, and still have Muhammad succeed. Of course, Muhammad had the Nation of Islam and the Fruit of Islam behind him, which is their security wing. But Carbo would go to different cities, as I said, in different places. And one of the saddest stories Jimmy Dundee said to me, and I knew it well because I knew the person, was about Ray Arcel. He said, you got to mention the Ray Arcel story in Boston. Ray Arcel was one of the great trainers. He was probably, Doc Bagley was the first modern trainer in boxing in the early 1900s. And the person he trained to be a trainer was Ray Arcel. And along with Arcel at that time, early 1900s, was Charlie Goldman. Ray Arcel trained Benny Leonard and Roberto Duran and Larry Holmes. Arcel was one of the all-time great sports trainers and one of the kindest people you'd ever meet. And so what happened was, because he worked with Freddie Brown and Whitey Bimstein and other trainers, he never made much money. So he had other jobs, during his life to make money to support his wife and kids. And he was living in Boston. And he was born in the Midwest, moved to New York, then moved to Boston. And ABC wanted to put on boxing shows at Boston Garden. And they asked him to help. And Arcel said to them, you can't use top-notch elite level fighters because Frankie Carbo controls them and he won't allow you unless he gets all your money, the fighters' money, the managers, all their money. And so you're going to have to use, club fighters, low-level club fighters. And ABC said, fine. It's a cheap shoot. It's 1, 2 cameras. We just get guys in the ring slugging each other. That's what the fans like, and it won't cost much. And so Arcel had to call Carbo to get clearance, and Carbo found out who the fighters were going to be, and he said, nah, I'm not interested in that garbage. No one's going to watch. Okay. And then, within a year, it was getting good ratings. There wasn't really much else at that time to watch on TV in the very early 1950s. And boxing was easy to film. So what happened was, after the ratings, it was in the newspapers that the ratings were going through the roof and they were making money. Carbo called Arcel and said, I want a piece now. And Arcel said, that has nothing to do with me. And he said, it has everything to do with you. You book it. No, I don't book it. They have their own bookers. And all I do is when they mention a fighter's name, I look it up and I call around and I make sure that he's a legitimate fighter. Whether he's good or not doesn't matter. I just make sure he's got a legitimate boxing license. And Carbo said, I don't care what you do. I want 75, 80% of what ABC is getting. And he said, Arcel said, Frankie, you can't shake down a TV network. They're not going to give you 75. Well, then I want 75, 80% of what the boxers are getting. They're getting a couple grand to fight, if that. Is it really worth that much? Well, I want what the promoters and managers are getting. He said some of the managers aren't even taking a fee because the money their boxers are getting is so little. They're doing it for the TV exposure. And Carbo just said, why are you arguing? Why are you talking like this to me? I am boxing. I run boxing. I told you what I want. Otherwise, if you can't do that, then stop the broadcast immediately. And Arcel said, I don't have the power to tell a network to stop broadcasting boxing or any show. And he said, and you're giving me much more credit here for my involvement. My involvement was more before, but now, because of my day job, it's practically nothing. Here's a fighter's name, Joe Blow. I call around. Is he a legitimate fighter? Yes, we gave him a license. And okay, he's legitimate. And then they use him. And that's all I do. He said, well, you're going to stop doing that then. And I want the money you're getting for that. And he said, but the money I'm getting has gone down by 75%. I used to be involved a lot more. Now I'm getting very little, if any, money. It's basically, go out and eat, take my wife out to dinner money once a week. And he said, that money goes to me now. Arcel said, I can't help you. This is a very, very small time organization and operation. And Carbo hung up, which was ominous. And a week or so later, Arcel's leaving the Boston Gardens and he gets hit in the head. The guy walks up behind him, hits him in the head with a lead pipe, fractures his skull, puts him in the hospital. And Mob says, you're no longer involved in boxing in any way, shape, or form. You have to write a letter, put it in the newspaper, which he did, saying that he's permanently retired from boxing in every capacity. And he did that. And eventually ABC just dropped their boxing in Boston because they don't want to deal with Frankie Carbo and the Mob. And that was one instance of Carbo really overplaying his hand, because Arcel was loved not only by people into sport, but by many of the newspaper men. So especially Dan Parker. So it was something they never should have done, but they did it. And this was the 1950s, 52, 53. The next fighter that Arcel worked with was Roberto Duran, and that was in 72, 73. And Carlos Salida, the manager of Roberto Duran, had to call around and make sure Carbo and all these other people were no longer involved. Garbo was alive then, but he died in '76, and he was let out of prison early he died in Florida. He was let out of prison early for health reasons. And there was a point when he was in prison where representatives of the Lucchese family came to him and said, "You're done. You're out of it." Because he did run it in prison. He ran boxing and he was able to get things going. But finally, the Lucchese family met and they just said it's not worth it anymore. He's too notorious. He gets too much bad publicity. It's costing us money. Let's get rid of him. And they said, well, and getting rid of a mob guy in prison is easy because the prison is run by the mob. So they just said, you know what? If we kill him in prison, it'll be another big story. Just tell him he's not involved and we'll take it over. And then, Don King became the man to help run it. So Carbo at that point was gone, but we're getting way ahead of ourselves. So in the 40s, there's fighters in every division, and you have guys like Oni Madden, as I mentioned earlier, who helped Henry Armstrong win 3 world championships, featherweight, lightweight, welterweight, because he wasn't drawing anyone. He was a great fighter, but he wasn't drawing anyone. And his management was Eddie Mead. That was his manager, who was also a mob appointed manager. And Eddie Mead, Fat Eddie Mead, was very close friends of Oni Madden. And I have a wonderful picture of Oni Madden, Eddie Mead, and Henry Armstrong in a boat in Arkansas, going, I don't know, on a pleasure cruise or about to go fishing. And the interesting thing, of course, was this is Arkansas. So this was a very racist state, but Oni Madden was the mob boss, and no one was going to tell him he couldn't have a black man and his wife on his boat. Anyone who spoke back like that to Oni Madden was immediately killed. So as I said, Madden's gone. He's in Arkansas. Carbo's taking over. Mike Jacobs is there, and they have, at that point, you've had Primo Carnera. Carnera lost the title to Max Baer, and people keep saying, how did Carnera lose the title to Max Baer? It doesn't make sense. And, well, it does make sense because the mob owned a piece of Max Baer, too. The mob would never allow one of their fighters to lose a title on the level unless they controlled a lot of the other fighter. The only time that happened was when Ali fought Liston the first time, and they presumed they could easily muscle in on Ali because Ali was managed by the Louisville 7, his white sponsors in Louisville. But he had switched by that time to the Nation of Islam, and they stood up to the mob, and that had never happened before. So and the mob wasn't prepared because the mob wasn't used to people standing up to them. So, we have Henry Armstrong, and then we have Lou, we have all these other great fighters that whose management, went back to the mob. The mob would get you, and they would get your manager, and they would tell your manager, we're taking over. And then weeks later, they would say to the manager, what are you doing here? This happened to the great Bill Miller. Bill Miller is one of the great trainers of all time. He trained James Toney. And he also had Johnny Saxton. And the mob said, we want him, we'll take him. And they said to Bill Miller, we'll give you 10 grand for him. And Miller took it because he knew if he didn't take it, he would have lost his fighter for nothing anyways. Miller was a brilliant trainer, but he was a brilliant man, and he knew how to circumvent the mob and train fighters without having to deal with them. This was probably a skill perfected by Chris Dundee. When Chris Dundee promoted and managed, he'd have various fighters, and the mob would say to him, Carver would say, Chris, your fighter's got to take a dive in that fight in a month, and he's going to go down in the 5th round. And Dundee's thinking, my guy's 30-0 with 28 knockouts. Your guy's, 8-1 with no knockouts. But he's not going to argue. You didn't argue. You got a beating if you argued. So he said, sure. He didn't even look up. Just be writing something or typing something, and he'd go, sure. And what would happen is Dundee was smart. Chris would go to the gym, and this would be February, and he'd say to the fighter, you finished your workout? Yeah, well, go take a jog in your trunks around the block. Well, I can't. It's February. I'll freeze to death. Just do it once. Why? Just do it like I told you. And he did. And the fighter would get a fever and get the flu, and he'd have to cancel the fight. And so Dundee had saved him. He had saved him from having to go down. He had another fighter and said, "I hate to tell you this, but your wife called, said she's leaving you for this guy." And the fighter got angry and punched a locker and then broke one of his fingers. And then later on, Dundee said, "I made it up to save you." And, have to tell Carbo, yeah, he broke his hand while sparring and he can't fight. And so this was the way Chris would use these different ruses um, to get around the mob, forcing his fighters to take a dive. And when they had the Kefauver Commission looking into organized crime's involvement in boxing, and that commission was an ongoing committee, it still exists to this day. They cleared Chris and Angelo. They said of any involvement with the mob at all ever. He said they were forced. Chris was forced to work with them. Angelo hated them. I was terrified of them, and Chris worked with them, but knew how to get around their nefarious schemes. In fact, Chris Dundee used to work with Frankie Carbo and Blinky Palermo on cross-country trains in the late 1930s, where they promoted fights. And he said Carbo would give away free peanuts that were salty, but charge you a lot of money for lemonade. And when the men wouldn't pay and their wives paid, he would take the men inside and say, "Next time you pay or you're off." Carbo found it an insult that they would force the women to pay. I mean, that's, bloodthirsty killer with manners. And so this was something he was involved with them. And, they gradually moved in to take over Oni Madden's vacated spot. And what happened was they had a meeting in New York, and just before Madden left, and the KZ family and different families said, "Listen, Oni, we all share rackets." This was after Prohibition had ended. He said, "We all have bootlegging organizations, different ones, all of us. We all made money. We all offer murder for hire and protection for hire. We all have gambling and prostitution. We all own linen stores, and we all own construction companies, and we all own unions. So we all share that, and you should share boxing. There's no reason why you should have 100% of it." And Oni Man was a smart man. He realizes these guys are going to take over anyways. They're going to start cutting into it, and I don't want to get into a fight with other mob families. Even though Oni Madden had Frank Costello behind him, along with Mayor Lansky and Lucky Luciano, he thought, fighting amongst each other is just going to make it bad for everyone. So he said, "Sure, you can have whatever. You can have this part and this part." And he probably ceded 25% of it to them. And of course, as he's exiled in Hot Springs, they're gradually moving in, chipping away at how much he runs. Madden's still making good money, but Carbo still keeps adding more fighters and more managers. And the list of managers and fighters he had was just incredible, because you look at it, and I made a list the other day of managers that were involved in boxing who were also involved with the mob, and it went for pages and pages and pages and pages. And there's a wonderful photo. I don't know if I have the book here with me. It's somewhere. It's Angelo Dundee's book, and it's called "My View from the Corner," and it was written with his son Chris Dundee and Bert Sugar. And there's a wonderful photo of thousands of people in it from the International Managers Guild, and you had to belong to that. And if your manager didn't belong to it, you didn't get a fight. And all these managers were guys that were knuckling under to the mob, or were actually mob guys themselves. And you look at this photo, and it's just all these, in Blinky Palermo's in it at the back, and it's the who's who of organized crime. Jimmy Dundee has the actual photo at home, but Angelo filled in every name of the thousands there. So yeah, you had Jack Dempsey there, some stars there, but you also had guys like Gaspipe Vocola, who was a well-known mob killer, but also acted as a manager. And what are you going to say to a guy like that when he says, "My fighter wins his fight"? I didn't agree to that. Doesn't matter what you agreed to. This is the way it goes down. And so this is what happened. And all these criminals, Eddie Coco, who was a mob boss, is in there, and all these different guys. I mean, the list is just endless. You had different murders too within that mob contingent that controlled boxing. If Carbo, for instance, was uh, thought to and arrested for killing a guy named Duffy in William Duffy in Atlantic City, who was a major bootlegger who was also moving in on Boo Boo Hoff and Waxy Gordon and other guys. And Hoff was from Philly, and this guy Duffy declared war on the Italian mobsters. He was Irish, and they said it was Carbo that went in and killed him. Although Carbo said, "I'm a bus driver and I was having a medical exam at that time." Now he was telling the truth and lying. He wasn't a bus driver, but he was having a medical exam. We still don't know who did it. It was thought that there were several other two Jewish mobsters from New York were sent, or from Philadelphia, who went and killed this guy. But Carbo took credit for it. Carbo also, when you saw the movie Bugsy, Elliot Gould's character Harry Big Greeny Greenberg was killed, and he was killed by Carbo. Ben Siegel, who was a Cold Stone killer, was supposed to be the guy killing him, and Ali TikTok Tenenbaum from Murder Incorporated, but they were all Murder Incorporated. But it was Carbo who was called in. It was a specialized hit, had to be done, and this guy had autism. He didn't know what he was doing when he was ratting on these guys. I wouldn't say ratting; he was testifying, and it wasn't really his fault. But just to make sure, they took him out, and it was Carbo who did it. Carbo was the one who also killed Ben Siegel. So Carbo was on retainer. It was one of the very few ever. It was on retainer for Murder Incorporated, used for specialized hits, and he was good at it. And as Bud Schulberg told me on the set of Cinderella Man, and I believe I mentioned this before. He said, when you're having breakfast in the morning and you're having scrambled eggs and you're reading a newspaper and you're looking at the newspaper, and as you're looking at the newspaper, you spill a bit of eggs on the newspaper. You don't even think about it. You just wipe it off and continue reading. He said that's what murder was like for Frankie Carbo. Just spilling eggs on a newspaper meant nothing to him. Just a cost of doing business. Didn't bother him at all. He could murder you and go out and have dinner with his friends. Not that he had any friends, he just had associates. So Carnera was controlled by Oni Madden. This was the thing about the movie The Harder They Fall. The Harder They Fall showed Rod Steiger as a guy named Nick Banco, who's supposed to be Frankie Carbo. And they show Humphrey Bogart, my favorite actor, Humphrey Bogart, as Eddie Willis. And everyone said he was the writer Jimmy Cannon. He was playing publicist Harold Conrad. What I said to Bud Schulberg was this didn't make sense to me because Carnera wasn't Carbo's fighter. Carnera was only Madden's fighter. He said, right, but I wanted to show them mob exploitation and who was in control at that time, meaning the 1950s when the movie was made. And he said, people often think Carbo didn't get involved until the 40s or 50s. He was there in the 30s as well. So Carbo controlled all these different fighters in different weight divisions. He controlled their management. He got a piece of everything. And he was just so greedy that eventually it became too much, and sponsors started to drop off in radio and later on in TV, and clubs started to close, and people started to not watch boxing. You can only insult fans' intelligence so much. When they watch a fighter like Carmen Basilio beat Johnny Saxton for 15 rounds and pummel him, and then lose the decision in Chicago where the judges were paid off to give it to Saxton, what can you do at that point? I mean, fans just say, well, that's it. We're not coming back. And that's when Chris Dundee was saying to Carbo, it's too much. It's just too much. You're so greedy that there's going to be no audience. And with no audience and no sponsors, you have no sport. There's no way to make money. The thing you want to do is to keep making money. And Chris Dundee was smart because he moved to Florida with Angelo in 1952 from New York. They're originally from Philadelphia. And he knew that all Carbo was interested in was money. Couldn't care less about the fights or the fighters or the managers or especially the fans. So Chris Dundee made a great deal with Frankie Carbo. He said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you an envelope. I'm going to give you 5 points or whatever it was, 5 points or 15 points every month, whether I put a fight on or not. So if I have 3 months in a row, and Chris also promoted wrestling. So if he had 3 or 4 months in a row, he promoted neither wrestling or boxing, Carbo still got money. And Angelo had to do the same. And they kept giving him money every single month. And in return, Carbo left them alone. Now, this is why this leads to one of the most iconic moments in all of professional boxing. There's a film I have, and I'm gonna get to Eric so he can play it next time. It's a film of Angelo Dundee and Jack Nyland, who was a Philadelphia mobster along with his brothers. Nyland controlled Sonny Liston. And Nyland in this film you see is at the Florida Boxing Commission office with Angelo Dundee and Chris Dundee. And Chris loved his baby brother Angelo and looked out for him. Chris was a tough guy. And Jack says, I demand to know who the referee is. In other words, what he's really saying is you have to look at the subtext. What he's really saying is, I want to know who the referee is so my guys can get to him and influence him. This is 1964. Carbo's still in jail, or he's just starting in jail. He's only been there a couple years, but he still runs boxing. And Boxing Commission said, no, we don't do it that way. We only announce it 15 minutes before the fight. Well, my guys aren't going to be happy about that. And then you can hear Chris Dundee said, my guys don't care what your guys think because my guys run everything. And he was referring to Carbo. In other words, he may be in prison, but he's still in charge. And whoever's running with your guys makes no difference because my guys run the sport. And you're not going to find out who the referee is until 50 minutes before the fight. And Angelo Dundee says to Jack Nyland, what do you care anyways? Your guy's going to win in, 60 seconds? You don't even need a referee. And Nyland says, yeah, I'm sorry. You're right. Doesn't matter who the referee is. You're right. I'll tell them. And basically, he'd been outflanked by Chris Dundee. It's Chris saying, I've been in the sport since the 1920s. I've dealt with these guys. I know how to work with these guys, and you don't. And, you're just being used by them, which Nyland was. Nyland was used by the mob. He was fleeced by the mob. He made very little money from Liston. Liston made almost no money from the mob. And that's what happened. And as we know, Ali went on and beat Liston. So 30s, 40s. Today, just want to talk about 35 to 45. And 45, Carbo's, he's really ensconced. He's in his glory. And that's when 20th Century Sporting Club is just about to end. Ends 4 years later when Joe Louis retires. And Louis was paying part of his money to the mob because they'd already, the mob affected every single fighter from Jack Dempsey all the way up to the 1970s, even although we're not going to go that far because it'd be a 50-part series. So for our own edification, we're just going to get to the early 1960s, but that's more than enough to show you what the damage and the hurt the mob did to the sport, because by the time the 1960s came around, even before that, in the 1950s, once the Kefauver Commission was going and was investigating organized crime controlled not only in trucking but in professional boxing, and it came out that all these different fights and fighters were controlled by the mob. Kid Gavlan was a mob fighter. Billy Graham beat him for the welterweight title, but because Graham and his manager Irvin Cohen wouldn't, do business with the mob, they weren't allowed to win. Even though he won the fight, it was given to Gavlan, and Gavlan cried when he beat Saxton in Philadelphia, although they gave it to Saxton because Saxton was a mob fighter. And the thing about Saxton was he praised Blinky Palermo publicly, which made him hated by other fighters. And he said that Gavlan was a poor loser, same as when he got a gift against Basilio. Of course, Basilio knocked him out in 9 rounds in the next fight, and then the rubber mat destroyed him in 2 rounds. Saxton ended up broke, committing crimes, and ended up in a mental asylum. And he made no money. And this is what the mob did. They did this to him. They did it to Dan Bucciarone. They did it to Coley Wallace. They did it to a lot of fighters. Jimmy Bivens. They did it. A lot of great fighters were taken on by the mob and just had all their money stolen. One of the fighters that was helped was Jersey Joe Walcott. He had Felix Bacicchio as his manager. He was a mob guy, and he liked Walcott, and he gave him money. He gave him money to help him train properly, and was behind him when he won the title. He was one of the anomalies. He was one of the guys that, for whatever reason, this mobster liked him and helped him. There are occasions like that where they help different people. But just like in the movie The Hustler, where Jackie Gleason says to Paul Newman at the very end, "You better pay him, Eddie," about Burt Gordon saying, "Where's my money?" George C. Scott's character. This happened every day in boxing, where boxers would get threatened and managers, and they were deciding what to do, and their friends would say, just pay him. You're better off paying him. Same thing with Jake LaMotta. LaMotta said to me that not only did he throw the Blackjack Billy Fox fight, he'd do it again, because otherwise he'd have no shot at getting a chance at the world middleweight title held by Marcel Cerdan. He said what upset him was when he spoke to the New York State Boxing Commission, and he claimed he had a ruptured spleen, and so they said he didn't throw the fight. Everyone knew he threw the fight, but LaMotta was angry because he wanted to say to the commission, but he wouldn't dare, "You guys have mobsters on the commission. You know the mob runs boxing, and yet you're giving the boxers a hard time. Why not just go after the real crooks and clean the sport up?" But they couldn't, because they've been bought off and they've been threatened. And so he throws the fight against Blackjack Billy Fox. Most of Fox's fights were fixed. And what happens to LaMotta? Does he get a title shot? Yeah, 3 years later, after he pays 25 grand to the mob. He still had to wait. But usually they would never, agreements like that were never fulfilled. But with LaMotta's case, it was fulfilled. So they screwed LaMotta. Carmen Basilio hated them, never did business with them. But his manager, John Dijon and Joe Nitro, they had to give up 30 to 35% of their fees, their managerial fees, to Frankie Carbo in order to get Basilio a shot at the welterweight title, which he won. And then they screwed him with Saxton, and then he won that. And then they had to give up more money to get a shot at Ray Robinson. Robinson said he would never do business with the mob, and then retired from boxing. They still approached him all the time. You lose the first fight, win the second, third's on the level, and he would say no. He was the biggest draw. I didn't need the mob. But then when he went away from boxing for 3 years in the 1950s, what happened with Robinson was he had all these businesses in Harlem, but his relatives took the businesses and ran them into the ground, stole all the money. So he had to join up with James D. Norris and do business with the mob. They made a lot of money off of him. There's no instance that we know of him throwing any of his fights. People have rumored that LaMotta may have thrown the fight from February 14th, 1951. I don't buy that. That fight was on the level. I don't think there's any conclusive evidence of Ray Robinson ever throwing a fight. But he didn't make as much money as he wanted to make because he had to give it up to the mob. They controlled it, and for him to get those fights, he had to give them a percentage. And that's what they did. They're going to take a lot of what the boxer makes, what the manager makes. They're going to take the gross gate receipts. They're going to take the TV money, radio money, everything. So just went on, from 1921 until the late 60s. And it went from Oni Madden to Frankie Carbo. A lot of people think after Madden left in 35, well, there was this big 5, 10, 15-year gap. And other guys ran it. Carbo moved into the vacuum right away. He was there, ready and waiting. And he had the Lucchese family behind him. He also had Blinky Palermo from the Philadelphia mob, who was kicking up money to other mobsters in Philadelphia, like Boo Boo Hoff, and all these other big mobsters, Waxy Gordon in New Jersey, Longy Zwillman in New Jersey, and all these other guys, Lansky, Luciano. Their money was getting kicked up to them, so they were providing the muscle for these mobsters to run the sport. People would say, well, Costello wasn't involved, or Lansky, Luciano. They were heavily involved, but they had the money to support and the muscle to help these guys pull off their schemes. Alistair, good to see you. Did the mob have a big effect on Charlie Burley? That's a good question. Charlie Burley, if you don't know, was one of the all-time great fighters, and Sugar Ray Robinson was supposed to fight him but didn't. Mike Jacobs wouldn't book him into a title fight. Burley fought from welter to middle to light heavy and beat everyone. I would say the mob did have an effect on him, Alistair, because Burley was out of Pittsburgh and he didn't have enough mob muscle behind him to get those fights. And he wasn't going to do business with them and give up. He's figuring, I'm not getting a title fight. Why would I give up money anyways to, in order to get a title fight? Mike Jacobs wouldn't book him into a title fight. He simply wouldn't do it. And a lot of guys ducked him. And he wasn't the only one. So Holman Williams was another one. So another great black fighter. So these guys, yes, the mob did have a deleterious effect on Charlie Burley and a lot of other fighters. But Burley is the one that really hurts because Burley was one of the all-time great, brilliant fighters offensively and defensively. And Burley was a guy who had a great career. And when it was over, he said, that's enough. I'm tired of playing this game. I'm not going to keep going on in false promises. I proved what I can do. You're not going to give me a chance. So I'm done. And good on him for that. Burley is remembered because his skill set was so pronounced. But he didn't have the requisite muscle behind him to help him move him into a title fight. You needed more muscle for that. People say, well, what about George Chuvalo? Chuvalo fought Ernie Terrell and beat him. Right, but Terrell had the Chicago mob, and George Terrell didn't have mob muscle. If Chuvalo had mob muscle behind him, it would have helped him when he fought Floyd Patterson, whom he beat but didn't get the decision. And this happened a lot of times. The most famous fight was the third fight between Kid Gavilan and Billy Graham. And Graham easily beat, not easily, but he beat Gavilan. But Gavilan got the decision because he had the mob behind him. And before the fight, Irving Cohen said to Carbo that my guy doesn't want to do business with you. No, it's not meant as an insult or anything. He just wants to do it on the level. And Carbo said, that's fine, but he's never going to win the title. And he never did. Graham was always announced. Billy Graham as the uncrowned world welterweight champion. And he was. And he beat Gavilan that night. But he did not get the title because the mob wouldn't allow it. And the mob did more damage to boxing financially and reputation-wise than any other single particular organization. It was the ruination of the sport. It's why boxing is now a niche sport rather than one of the two top sports in the United States, which were at that time baseball and boxing. I want to thank you for watching. I'm Lou Eisen. This has been Ring Talk and for this weekend. And we'll see you again next week. Be well. Speak soon. Bye-bye.